call this the Google Android. Now, each one of these lobes, okay, so you have your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, and your occipital lobe, okay? This would be the optic nerve, okay? Now, I wanted AMD, you know, because of radon, you know, to do the occipital lobe because they're graphics processors and CPUs and stuff. And it would have like an Android operating system, and Kodak do the lens and stuff like that for the eyeball. Basically, Kodak do the eye because of their profession in cameras and stuff, and AMD because of their graphics and CPUs and stuff. But anyway, imagine these are all like phones. See, consider this is the hippocampus. That's where your main operating system is. Now, these have their own operating systems, memory and storage. That way, they're able to communicate on their own and do their own sets of instructions. But they actually work from a secondary operating system. The primary operating system that controls them is in the hippocampus, or the main drive. Now, each one of these would have its own. They would be, you know, different lobe in the brain, and each one would be able to communicate with each other. What I call these balance bridges, and that helps these lobes communicate with each other. And as the operating system basically controls them, depending on what it's learning and depending what it sees and what it learns, everything, it'll store it in a different section in the brain. Okay, now you got your fiber optics for your nervous system. Now, I was thinking some kind of colloidal gel or something along the lines of antifreeze for the coolant, because you don't want it getting too hot. It'd be kind of like a cooling system, liquid cooling system for a CPU and a heat sink, you know, in a computer. Now, you already have 8 lobes, and that would be 8 multi-core computers hooked up to one main computer. And this would basically emulate a human brain. Now, if somebody's good with Arduinos, they would actually be able to rig up Arduinos together and have those operate and communicate with each other that are ran by one main computer too. Or they could each have their own, just like these phones do, and they could be ran by this main operating system. But there's a primary operating system and a secondary operating system. All these are ran by the secondary operating system, which would be, I'd like to, you know, think Android would come across it, you know, and create a true Android, the Google Android. I thought it was kind of a cool concept. But this is when I think they actually are able to make their own decisions. Okay, say it learns so many millions of things, okay? Each time it learns something, it writes it into code. And these segmented codes, like say it learns something in 10110.101 is what it programs in its head, okay? Now, these .101s, these segmented areas are going to be set aside and written in for optimal use, okay? So the computer is going to know exactly what to do with it and use it whenever it needs to. I think whenever these segmented codes exceed the main processings, or the main operating system's instructions, then I believe that's when the computer can actually decide on what it wants to do. It can literally make its own decisions from there on out. It's almost like a Office Space. You know how every time there's a transaction, they get certain bits and pieces of each transaction, and it all adds up over time? Well, basically, that's what happens. Every time it learns something, these segmented codes are stored, and whenever that storage pretty much exceeds the main operating system, it'll become aware that it can make its own choice. It might not become self-aware, it might not recognize its own existence, but it will actually be able to make its own choices. You know, it would be able to either decide if it's optimal to use what it was programmed with, or if it's optimal to use what it programmed itself. And being a computer and being optimal as they are, it will probably go with what it wrote, because that is better than what we would program in its head. If it was a learning computer, then whatever it learns and programs, it's going to see more as efficient way of doing things, basically. And you're not going to be able to discern what it's thinking either, because it could learn and set these instructions in this main lobe, and these lobes here differently than another person's computer. It would learn things differently, or it probably has a totally different code that it wrote. So depending on what it learned compared to another one, you're never going to have the same decision from each one, because they're always learning different things from different people and stuff like that. So once it writes that code, you're really not going to be able to tell. Each individual bot or android will be its own individual android. It will be unique.